Then she mentioned, almost in passing, that Patrick had transferred control of the family trust to her 6 months earlier. I froze, my breath catching somewhere in my chest. I had co-managed that trust with him for nearly 2 decades. He had never once mentioned handing it over. Not once. Somewhere down the table, a young associate cleared his throat and made a note. Another poured himself water from a glass pitcher, the sound obscenely loud in a room where no one else was breathing normally. I watched Rebecca's mouth move, forming words like liquidity and restructuring and fiduciary responsibility, and I thought, absurdly, of how she used to call me Mom at holiday dinners, how she'd once cried on my shoulder after a miscarriage years ago, how I had believed, foolishly, that grief like that bonds people permanently. I understood now that grief bonds nothing. Only truth does that, and truth was the one thing missing from this room. She kept reading through the allocations, her voice steady, unwavering, as though she were reciting a grocery list. My name never came up. When one of the younger associates finally asked, almost hesitantly, about my share, she answered flatly, without so much as glancing my way. There were no remaining distributions assigned to me under the current filing. No eye contact, no explanation, just erasure delivered in the flat, sterile language of law. I said nothing. My hand stayed still in my lap, though something hot and sharp climbed up my spine. I stood, adjusted my scarf, and walked out into the cold without looking back. One sentence looping endlessly in my mind. There are no remaining distributions assigned to her. I wasn't a widow anymore. I wasn't even a footnote in the margins of my own life. That evening, I sat in the dark for a long time, unable to bring myself to turn on a single light, as if the darkness itself was a kind of company. Later, almost without meaning to, my hands acting faster than my mind could catch up, I opened the drawer of Patrick's old desk. It squeaked the way it always had. He used to joke it needed oil, and I always said I liked it exactly as it was, because that sound meant he was near. Beneath a stack of receipts and his favorite mechanical pencil, worn smooth from years of use, I found a manila folder I didn't recognize. No label. No date. My fingers hesitated on the edge of it before I finally opened it. Inside were 3 pages. The first, in his unmistakable, slightly shaky handwriting, the kind that had grown thinner and more fragile in his final months, read like a quiet confession. Rebecca had pushed him to update the will, insisting it needed to reflect current holdings. He'd asked her why now, and she'd said it was for clarity. He wrote that he thought she was being careful. Too careful. He admitted he hadn't told me. He admitted he was afraid of the questions I would have asked, questions he didn't yet have answers for. The second page was a marked-up copy of a will I had never seen before, red pen circling entire clauses, my name crossed out beside a scrawled note in the margin. Discuss with Rebecca. I stared at that crossed-out name for a long time, as if staring hard enough might undo it. The third page was a typed schedule of legal consultations, dated back to when he was deep in treatment. Meetings I never knew took place, scheduled during the rare hours Rebecca had insisted on taking over his care, so I could rest. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the study, rereading those 3 pages until the sky outside shifted slowly from black to a pale, uncertain gray. By dawn, I understood this wasn't an oversight, wasn't some clerical mistake buried in paperwork. It was calculated, deliberate, built piece by piece while I sat beside a hospital bed, exhausted and trusting. I hid the folder beneath a stack of old magazines in the hallway closet, and the next morning, with my hands still unsteady, I called Daniel Cole, an old friend Patrick had trusted completely for as long as I'd known him. He agreed to meet the next day, his voice calm, but edged with quiet concern. We sat in a quiet cafe off Elm Street, the same worn wooden booths I remembered from years ago, the same soft jazz humming overhead, chipped mugs steaming between us. He read through the folder in silence, his coat still damp from the morning drizzle, his jaw tightening visibly when he reached Patrick's handwritten note. He flipped back and forth through the pages, stitching together a timeline in his head. "This isn't sloppy," he finally said, setting the folder down. "This is intentional." He pulled a small notepad from his coat pocket and began jotting down dates, names, discrepancies. He pointed out that the witnesses on the revised will were strangers, not the neighbors or old friends from the golf club that Patrick always insisted on using. We agreed to investigate quietly, starting with certified copies of the will filed with the county, cross-checked against the notes I already had. Before we parted, Daniel reached across the table and covered my hand with his, briefly, the way an old friend does when words feel insufficient. "Patrick will want you to fight for this," he said. "Not for the money. For the truth of it." I nodded, unable to speak for a moment, watching steam curl off my untouched tea. Outside, the drizzle had turned to a steady, gray rain, and I remember thinking that even the sky seemed to understand the weight of what we were about to begin. Digging through Patrick's old leather planner that evening, I found a name circled twice in pencil. Hal Givens, a tax consultant he'd met years earlier through a nonprofit board. I hadn't seen him in ages, and the fact that Patrick had met with him during his illness without ever mentioning it stung more than I wanted to admit. Daniel reached out discreetly. What Hal remembered chilled me to the bone. Patrick, frail and exhausted, barely able to hold a pen steady, asking careful questions about protections for me, about naming beneficiaries clearly. Then hesitating, saying Rebecca would take care of it, that she was helping. Hal had offered an independent review, just to be sure everything was transparent. A week later, Rebecca had called to cancel it, saying it was no longer needed. Hal told Daniel something else, almost as an aside, that stayed with me for days afterward. He said Patrick had looked, more than once, like a man who wanted to say something and kept swallowing it back down. My daughter-in-law rose at the reading of my husband's will and calmly announced that I had been written out of his $77 million estate. I sat there, drained of every tear I had left, my hands folded so tightly in my lap that my knuckles had gone white. I was the one who had fed him, bathed him, held his hand through the nights he couldn't walk on his own, the one who had memorized the sound of his breathing so well that I could tell, even in sleep, when something was wrong. Yet she spoke as though I had never existed at all, as though 4 decades of marriage could be dismissed with a single sentence read off a page. But when the attorney let out a laugh, short, involuntary, almost embarrassed, something in that room shifted, and I knew, with a certainty I couldn't explain, that this wasn't over. What had Patrick hidden before he passed? And why did it feel, in that moment, like he was still trying to speak to me from somewhere far away, as if his voice were trapped behind glass? I stood alone in the garden after the funeral, watching the last cars pull out of the driveway one by one, gravel crunching beneath their tires until the sound faded into silence. Half-empty cups sat abandoned on the folding tables, lipstick stains on some, condensation pooling beneath others. The scent of wilting lilies clung to the air, sweet and heavy in a way that made my stomach turn. No one turned back to check on me, not even Rebecca. She had organized everything down to the last napkin. The flowers, the slideshow set to soft piano music, the seating chart that somehow placed me at a table near the back. It was flawless in the coldest possible way, so precise it left no room for grief, no room for the mess that real mourning demands. Patrick would have despised it. He always said a funeral should be loud and imperfect, people crying too hard, laughing at the wrong moments, forgetting where they parked, someone inevitably spilling wine on the good tablecloth. He wanted noise, chaos, proof that people had actually loved him enough to fall apart a little. This one felt like a performance I hadn't been cast in, a play stage for an audience that didn't include me. I remember standing near the rose bushes he'd planted the spring after his first surgery, running my thumb along a thorn just to feel something sharp instead of numb. A caterer folded up the last table, glancing at me with the kind of pity reserved for people who don't quite belong in the scene anymore. I want to tell her I used to belong here more than anyone. I want to tell someone, anyone, that I had memorized the exact rhythm of Patrick's cough in his final weeks, that I knew which pills came before food and which came after, that I had learned to read his silences the way other people read newspapers. None of that had made it onto the seating chart. When I walked back inside, the house felt too quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears. Rebecca was already collecting the paperwork off the dining table, stacking it with mechanical precision, corners aligned, edges squared. Without lifting her eyes, she told me the legal proceedings would begin the following week, that she'd already spoken with the firm, that everything was under control. There was no question of what I wanted, no acknowledgement of the 6 months I'd spent sleeping upright in a hospital chair, my neck aching every morning, while she jetted off to conferences in cities I couldn't even picture her visiting. Then she handed me a small box, wrapped in plain brown paper, as if it were an afterthought. Inside was nothing but a silver tie clip. No letter, no note, not even his initials engraved on it. Patrick had drawers full of journals, letters we'd exchanged, even while living under the same roof. Notes he used to leave on my pillow, just because. And this, apparently, was what remained for me. I turned it over in my palm, waiting for it to mean something. It never did. I stood there in the dining room a moment longer, watching Rebecca gather the last of the folders into her bag with the same brisk efficiency she brought to everything. She glanced at her watch once, twice, the way people do when they're already halfway out the door in their minds. I wanted to ask her why. Why the tie clip? Why nothing else? Why the silence dressed up as thoughtfulness? But the words wouldn't come. Grief has a way of stealing your voice right when you need it most, leaving you standing in your own kitchen, holding a stranger's idea of closure. That night, sitting with a cup of tea gone cold in my hands, I realized I no longer felt at home in the house we'd built together over 30-some years. His aftershave still lingered faintly in the hallway closet. His books still lined the shelves in careful, alphabetized rows, the way he liked them. Yet somehow my name had quietly vanished from every corner of it, as if someone had gone room by room, erasing me with a soft eraser, careful not to leave marks. Something colder than grief had settled over me, something I couldn't quite name. It felt like everyone else had been handed a new script for how this story was supposed to go, and mine had simply been torn out of the binding, page by page, without anyone bothering to tell me. The summons to the estate meeting came by email, brisk and impersonal, sent from an assistant rather than Rebecca herself, as if even the courtesy of a personal message was too much to ask. No warmth, no, how are you holding up, just a date, a time, an address formatted like a dental appointment reminder. I read it 3 times before I set my phone down. I arrived a few minutes late, uncertain the entire drive whether I should even show up at all. My hands had trembled slightly on the steering wheel. The office smelled of eucalyptus and fresh ink, sterile and cold in a way that made my throat tighten. A young receptionist eyed me with faint confusion, glancing at a clipboard, before leading me down a long hallway to the conference room. 7 people in dark suits sat around a long table, papers arranged neatly before them, pens uncapped and ready. Rebecca, at the head, barely glanced up as she gestured toward the one open seat, far from the folders, far from the coffee, far from anything that suggested I belonged there. No one offered me paperwork. No one offered me a word greeting. She began outlining the estate in a clipped, business-like tone. Stocks, 2 commercial properties, a partial share in a winery Patrick had once invested in with friends over a long, laughing dinner I remembered vividly. Near the end of their last meeting, Patrick had asked him, almost offhandedly, whether a person could quietly reinstate an earlier version of a document if they changed their mind later. Hal had said yes, of course, if it was done properly, with witnesses, with counsel present. Patrick had nodded slowly and said he'd think about it. He never called back. Hal assumed, at the time, that Patrick had simply grown too tired to pursue it, that illness had a way of narrowing a person's remaining energy down to only the most urgent tasks. Now, hearing the full picture, Hal wondered aloud whether Patrick had run out of time rather than resolve, whether the thinking he needed to do had simply outlasted him. That night, I paged slowly through an old photo album, no longer for comfort, but for something closer to forensic clarity. In nearly every photograph, holidays, dinners, family gatherings, Rebecca hovered somewhere at the edges, smiling, helpful, always managing some small detail, always positioned exactly where trust could be earned. I'd once mistaken that for loyalty, even affection. Now, looking at the same photographs with new eyes, I saw a woman who had been quietly positioning herself for years, patient as frost creeping across a window. The following Monday, Daniel called with more unsettling news, his tone faster now, more urgent though still measured. The will filed with the county carried a different case number than the draft Patrick and I had reviewed together a year earlier, and that original version had simply vanished from the record, marked superseded, with no trace of who had authorized the change. He wanted to bring in a specialist, Lydia Velasquez, a probate litigation attorney with experience in contested wills and document fraud. I hesitated only briefly before agreeing. We met in Daniel's office on a gray Wednesday morning. Lydia moved through the evidence with a kind of surgical focus, asking sharp, precise questions, none of them directed at soothing me. When Daniel mentioned the unfamiliar witnesses, her eyebrow lifted slightly. She recognized their names from another case entirely. Unlicensed notaries known for signing documents without proper presence or review. This wasn't careless, she said, setting down her pen. This was built. She said she'd file a quiet inquiry with the probate court, careful not to alert anyone prematurely. Lydia was in her mid-50s, dressed simply, with the kind of economy of movement that comes from decades of not wasting time on anything that doesn't matter. She had a habit of tapping her pen twice against the table before she spoke, as though giving herself one last moment to choose her words with precision. When she finally looked up at me directly for the first time that morning, her expression wasn't sympathy exactly. It was something steadier, closer to respect. "You did the right thing bringing this in," she said. "Most people bury it instead. Grief makes people want to look away." I told her I had looked away for 6 months already, watching Patrick fade in a hospital bed, and I didn't have it in me to look away from anything else ever again. She nodded once, like that answer had told her everything she needed to know about whether I'd see this through to the end. Back home, I searched Patrick's old file cabinet in the garage, the one that still smelled faintly of tobacco and pine. In a folder marked with the previous year's date, I found an unsigned trust addendum. Under a section titled Survivor Protections, my name appeared clearly, surrounded by his handwritten notes about health care, housing, legal support, everything he had wanted to guarantee for me, written in the careful, deliberate hand of a man trying to leave nothing to chance. Beside it, one line stopped me cold. "We talked about this. Rebecca said she'd handle it." It felt like watching, on paper, the exact moment he had handed over the reins, out of exhaustion or misplaced trust, or both. I made a copy and brought it to Daniel the next morning. Lydia reviewed it carefully and said it strengthened our case significantly. She filed a motion to freeze the estate. Not for revenge, she reminded me gently, but for protection, so Rebecca couldn't move funds or reassign property titles while the investigation continued. 3 days later, the motion was approved. I didn't celebrate. I simply exhaled, long and slow, and let the quiet settle over me like the first solid step forward after a long fall. That same week, an envelope arrived with no return address. A glossy invitation to a private tribute Rebecca was hosting at the country club in Patrick's honor, complete with cocktails, catered hors d'oeuvres, and a charity auction bearing his name. I hadn't been consulted on a single detail, not a phone call, not even a text. Still, I decided to go, not for confrontation, but simply to stand quietly and deliberately in a room she had tried to erase me from. I dressed carefully that Saturday. Navy slacks, the silk blouse Patrick had given me for our 35th anniversary, a thin silver chain, nothing loud, everything intentional. The country club parking lot was already full when I arrived. Inside, the room glowed with soft light, polished wood floors, floral centerpieces, a large gold-framed photo of Patrick near the bar, the tired, weakened version Rebecca had insisted on using for the obituary, the one I hated. Rebecca moved through the room like a queen greeting loyal subjects, composed, elegant, every gesture calculated. When she saw me, her expression flickered for just a second before settling back in a practiced warmth. I stood near the entrance for a moment longer than I needed to, letting the noise of the room wash over me. Laughter, clinking glasses, a string quartet, playing something soft and forgettable in the corner. A waiter offered me champagne, and I took it just to have something to hold. I recognized faces everywhere. Patrick's old golf partners, a woman who had once taught piano to our nephew, a couple who had vacationed with us in the Outer Banks the summer before his diagnosis. None of them approached first. They watched me the way people watch a stranger who has wandered into a wedding uninvited, unsure whether to smile or look away. I smiled anyway, because Patrick had taught me that dignity costs nothing and buys everything. At an auction table labeled Patrick's Favorite Things, I found a first edition novel I had given him years ago, its spine worn soft from rereading. My name was nowhere near it. A former business partner of Patrick's approached, kind-eyed, assuming I still oversaw the trust, asking casually whether I'd made changes to the fund allocations. When I told him I'd been removed before Patrick even passed, his polite smile faltered into visible confusion. It was a small moment, but it told me everything. Rebecca hadn't told the full truth to everyone. Another guest, one of Patrick's old board colleagues, mentioned almost in passing that he'd received an email from her weeks before Patrick's death, referencing suggested donation amounts and the phrase, managing partner responsibilities. I thanked him, smiled, and excused myself 20 minutes later, sitting in my car with the engine off, hands resting on the wheel, letting it all settle into place. Rebecca hadn't waited for Patrick to die. She had begun the transition while he was still breathing, using his illness as cover and my silence as permission. That silence, I decided in that moment, was ending. The next morning, Lydia and Daniel began drafting a formal motion to contest the will, not just for my share, but for the truth of Patrick's real intentions, for the integrity of everything we had built. I spent the days between the country club tribute and the next phone call trying to hold on to some version of normal life. I watered the plants. I attended my book club, though I barely spoke a word the entire evening, nodding along while someone else's voice discussed a novel I hadn't finished. I went grocery shopping and stood too long in front of the tea aisle, unable to remember what I'd come for. On the surface, everything looked unchanged. Underneath, I was alert in a way I hadn't been in years, watching, listening, waiting for the next thread to pull loose. Rain fell steadily the following Monday, thin and unyielding against the kitchen window, when Daniel called to confirm the motion had been filed on grounds of fraud and undue influence. A preliminary hearing was scheduled within 2 weeks, opening the door to discovery, internal communications, financial records, digital files. At Lydia's office that afternoon, surrounded by color-coded tabs and a timeline taped along the wall, I found a printed email Rebecca had sent 6 weeks before Patrick's death, marked confidential, instructing her team to expedite the finalization of trust documents and strip out every clause she considered discretionary. One line referenced me directly, brief and clinical. Remove co-beneficiary privileges per our discussion. Decades of marriage, reduced to a single sentence buried in someone else's inbox. By Thursday, subpoenas were issued for full access to Patrick's digital communications during his final 6 months, and a deposition was requested from one of Rebecca's legal assistants, the woman who had notarized the disputed documents under her supervision. Daniel found something else troubling while reviewing the files. 2 signature timestamps logged on a Sunday evening, when the office should have been closed entirely. Patrick hated working weekends. He never signed anything without asking me to read it first. When I read that detail, my hands went still. That weekend, I drove out to the cemetery. The sky hung low and gray above the quiet rows of headstones. I stood at Patrick's grave for a long while, reading the simple inscription beneath his name. He lived with grace. He left with love, without speaking a single word aloud. I let the weight of the moment settle fully into me. He had trusted the wrong person, and he had left too much unresolved. But I no longer held that against him. I would protect the truth myself now, in his place. A groundskeeper passed by with a wheelbarrow of mulch, nodding politely before continuing on. I knelt down and brushed a few stray leaves off the base of the headstone, the way I used to smooth his collar before we left for church. I told him, silently, that I understood now. Understood the fear that must have gripped him near the end, the exhaustion that made trusting someone easier than questioning them. I told him I forgave him for the silence, even if I hadn't yet forgiven Rebecca for the calculation behind it. Forgiveness, I was learning, didn't have to arrive all at once for everyone in the same measure. Some of it could be given freely. Some of it would have to be earned. That Tuesday, the city still wrapped in early fog. I met Ava Kendall, the legal assistant, at Lydia's office. She arrived exactly on time, gray cardigan, no makeup, a restless kind of resolve in her hands. She explained, carefully and without embellishment, how Rebecca had rushed the estate revisions through in just 6 weeks, bypassing the usual meetings, review sessions, and notarized acknowledgments. She recalled one evening, staying late to retrieve her jacket, finding Rebecca and another staffer in the conference room with a stack of unsigned forms. Rebecca had asked her to witness a signature. She never saw Patrick sign it directly. When she asked, Rebecca brushed it off. He just stepped out. It was urgent. Just witness it. No big deal. Ava had written the moment down in her planner that same night. 7:43 p.m., Sunday. Witness signature for R. No P present. She also remembered overhearing Rebecca on a call in her office, 2 days before Patrick's final hospitalization, speaking the words, liquidate silently. No delays. Ava had stayed silent out of fear. A mortgage, a child, a job she couldn't afford to lose. But hearing how much had come into question now, she said quietly, she couldn't stay silent any longer. She signed her statement and dated it without hesitation. There was a long pause after she set down the pen, the kind of silence that follows a decision that can't be undone. Lydia thanked her gently and asked if she wanted water, or a few minutes alone before Daniel walked her out. Ava shook her head, staring at her own signature as though seeing it for the first time. She told us, almost as an afterthought, that she had liked Patrick, that he always remembered her name, always asked about her daughter, always thanked the assistants by name instead of walking past them the way most executives did. He deserved better than what happened to him, she said quietly, and something in her voice cracked just slightly before she caught herself. Daniel walked her to the elevator, and when he came back, he sat down heavily and exhaled like a man who had been holding his breath for weeks. Lydia placed both hands flat on the table and said simply that this was the break we needed. It wasn't suspicion anymore. We had a timestamp, a first-hand witness, and language suggesting manipulation with intent, enough to bring the entire matter before a judge. 2 days later, a letter arrived from Rebecca's attorney, polished, cold, accusing me of interfering with a lawful estate transition, claiming I was motivated by grief and bitterness, threatening legal costs if I didn't withdraw within 10 business days. I read it 3 times before folding it neatly and setting it beside my morning coffee. I called Daniel and told him I'd been more than okay for years. I'd just been quiet, and silence was never the same thing as surrender. He laughed softly on the other end of the line and said that was the best thing he'd heard all week, that most clients needed convincing to fight, and I clearly needed no convincing at all, only the tools. That afternoon, Lydia filed our full rebuttal. Ava's notarized statement, metadata comparisons, Patrick's earlier drafts, and security logs proving he hadn't even entered the building the weekend the disputed documents were supposedly signed. Soon after, a cream-colored invitation slipped through my front door. No stamp, no envelope address, just quietly delivered. It called for a foundation board meeting to formalize Rebecca's transfer of executive authority, dressed up in procedural language as though nothing at all was in question. I decided to attend, calm and unhurried, telling Daniel not to worry, that I only needed to witness it myself. The new glass office downtown felt sterile and unfamiliar, all marble floors and quiet elevators. Rebecca sat at the head of the table in a tailored dark blue suit, her hair pulled into a perfect knot, poised as ever. The meeting opened with pleasantries, donation reviews, notes on upcoming initiatives, strategic language wearing the mask of sincerity. When they reached the item marked transition of executive oversight, Rebecca cleared her throat and began thanking everyone for their support, speaking of Patrick's vision, of continuity, of the weight of responsibility. Then she turned toward me, said I had stood by Patrick in his early years, helped lay the foundation for what the organization had become. And then, the line I will never forget, and now, with your grace, I carry it forward. The words landed like a slap, dressed up as a compliment. Your grace. As though I had bowed out willingly. As though I had handed her the keys myself, smiling, grateful to be relieved of the burden. I felt every eye in the room shift toward me, waiting, the way an audience waits for the wronged widow to nod politely and disappear back into the wallpaper. I could feel my own pulse in my throat. Somewhere beneath the table, my hand found the small envelope I had carried in my bag all morning, its edges already soft from how many times I had touched it, rehearsing this exact moment without knowing when it would come. I said nothing. I simply reached into my bag, pulled out a small envelope containing Ava's notarized statement and a marked copy of the altar trust page, and passed it quietly to the man beside me, one of Patrick's oldest friends, still on the board. He looked confused but took it, passed it along, and within moments it had traveled down the length of the table. I watched faces change as they read. A raised brow here, a sharp intake of breath there. One man setting down his pen entirely and staring at the page as though it might rearrange itself into something less damning. Rebecca's composure cracked, her hands going still on the folder in front of her, her jaw tightening in a way I had only ever seen once before, the night she found out Patrick had changed his mind about something small and insignificant, years ago, before any of this began. I stood, thanked them for the invitation, said my attorney would be in touch if anyone required clarification, and walked out. Not rushed, not angry, just clear. Within days, the board postponed their vote entirely and requested a neutral third-party review. Rebecca's attorney went silent. That Sunday afternoon, Lydia called with the news I had been waiting weeks to hear. Rebecca was withdrawing entirely from her position as managing executive, citing a desire to preserve the foundation's reputation and respect Patrick's legacy. No admission of wrongdoing, but no more resistance either. I didn't celebrate. I simply stepped outside, let the cold winter air hit my face, honest and clarifying, and stood there for a long, quiet moment. The days after Rebecca's withdrawal were strangely still. No calls, no threats, no letters wrapped in careful legal language. It felt as though a curtain had fallen on the stage she'd so carefully built, and the audience had quietly slipped out of their seats while I wasn't looking. Lydia warned me that this kind of silence often meant people were regrouping rather than surrendering, but this time I wasn't the one who needed to prepare. I had already told the truth. Now it was hers to carry. That week, going through the top drawer of Patrick's desk, I found a sealed envelope tucked behind an old ledger. An earlier will, dated a full year before Rebecca's revised version, detailing his true wishes for the foundation, the trust, and my role as lifelong co-trustee. In the margins were personal notes, memories of trips we had taken together, quiet reflections on legacy and balance. He had written that family was never about last names or blood ties, but about standing beside each other in silence when no one else was watching. I sat with that letter until the room went dark around me, then brought it to Daniel the next morning, not as evidence for any court, but as history worth preserving properly. I read certain lines over and over that night, the way you press on a bruise just to confirm it's still there. In one margin, beside a paragraph about the scholarship fund, he had written simply, "We'll know what to do with this when I can't." I hadn't known, at the time he wrote it, that he already suspected he wouldn't be the one steering things to the end. There was a kind of grief in that sentence that outweighed even the one I'd carried at his funeral. The grief of realizing he had been quietly preparing to hand the wheel to me, and somewhere along the way, someone else had reached for it first. I traced his handwriting with my fingertip, the way I used to trace the lines on his palm when we sat together on the porch in the evenings, and I let myself cry for the first time in what felt like months, not out of despair, but out of something closer to relief. Weeks later, I returned to the foundation for the first time since everything had unraveled. The atmosphere felt different now, quieter, less polished, more honest. The new committee greeted me warmly and asked for guidance on one of Patrick's early scholarship programs. I wasn't there to reclaim a title or a position. I was there simply to witness, to make sure what we had built together survived intact, untouched by anyone else's edits. That spring, I received a letter from a young woman who had once received a scholarship through our foundation years earlier. She was now mentoring girls in her old neighborhood, unaware of everything that had happened behind the scenes, only aware that something we had started had reached her, and that she was now passing it forward to someone else. Reading her words in my kitchen, surrounded by the same silence that had once felt like erasure, I realized the silence now held something entirely different: memory, clarity, and something close to peace. Her letter was handwritten, slightly uneven in places, the kind of penmanship that comes from someone writing quickly because the feeling couldn't wait for careful cursive. She described a girl she now mentored, 15 years old, sharp and guarded, the way she herself had once been. She wrote that she often repeated something Patrick had told her once at a scholarship dinner years ago: that potential doesn't ask permission to exist, it simply waits for someone to notice it. She said she hoped, someday, to build something of her own that would outlast her the way this foundation had outlasted its founder. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in the same drawer where I kept Patrick's early sketches for the foundation's charter, side by side, two different handwritings separated by decades, but somehow speaking the same language. Spring deepened, the daffodils in the community garden blooming first, followed by soft blush tulips along the sidewalk outside the foundation office. An invitation arrived for the annual donor luncheon, an event Patrick and I had helped establish 2 decades earlier, but hadn't attended in years. I chose to go, not to prove anything, but because I finally could, without needing to. I wore a soft gray suit and pinned Patrick's old lapel pin to my collar, a small silver oak tree, steady and rooted, quiet in its own way. The ballroom hadn't changed, polished floors, round tables, soft music drifting overhead. Rebecca wasn't there. Her name had faded entirely from the printed programs, replaced by the interim committee and a new vision statement. Near the end of the event, a young board member named Lee took the stage. She thanked those who had guided the foundation through its transition, spoke briefly of Patrick's original mission, and then paused, looking in my direction, saying my name, not with ceremony, but with genuine warmth. She spoke of the quiet strength of those who had held that mission through the storm. The room turned toward me in a gentle wave of applause. I stood only briefly, nodding once, not for recognition, not for attention, but as a final, quiet gesture, an acknowledgement that the long road I had walked no longer needed to stay hidden. It had a name now, and that was enough. I remember the exact texture of that applause. Not thunderous, not performative, just warm and sustained, the kind that comes from people who mean it. An older woman at my table, someone I barely knew, reached over and squeezed my hand without a word. Across the room, I caught the eye of the board member who had once passed Ava's statement down the table months earlier. He raised his glass slightly, just an inch, just enough. I understood it as its own kind of testimony. That night, I walked home alone, passing the old bookstore where Patrick used to stop every single Sunday without fail. I smiled, seeing his favorite novel still displayed proudly in the window. Back in my own kitchen, I brewed a cup of tea and opened the back door, stepping out into air that was cool, soft, and completely still. I looked up at the sky. It stretched wide and open above me, entirely mine. I was not a woman erased. I was not a placeholder in someone else's version of legacy. I was whole, and for the first time in a very long while, I was finally home, in my own story, written in my own hand. I thought, standing there, of all the small rooms I'd sat in over the past year. The conference room where my name had been read out of existence. The cafe booth where Daniel first said the word intentional. The cemetery where I stood without speaking. The ballroom where my name was finally spoken with warmth instead of formality. Each room had asked something different of me. Patience, courage, silence, and finally voice. I had given each of them what they asked for, and somehow, impossibly, I had come out the other side still myself. Maybe even more myself than I had been in years. In the weeks that followed, I found myself returning often to that same back step, tea in hand, watching the seasons shift the way they always had, indifferent to everything I'd been through. I thought about Ava, who had risked her livelihood to tell the truth. I thought about Lydia and Daniel, who had shown up not just as professionals, but as people who believed, quietly and fiercely, in doing right by someone else's story. And I thought about Patrick, not as the man who had left me exposed in his final months, but as someone who had tried, in his own imperfect way, to protect me, even when fear and illness clouded his judgment. I had stopped needing him to have been perfect. I only needed to know that some part of him had wanted the truth to survive him, and it had. One evening, sorting through a box of old correspondence I'd never gotten around to opening, I found a stack of birthday cards Patrick had kept from every year of our marriage. Mine to him, tucked away carefully, some with pressed flowers still faintly visible between the folds. I sat on the floor of the study and read every single one, laughing at the silly jokes I'd forgotten writing, tearing up at the ones where I'd simply written "still choosing you" without explanation, because some years that was all there was to say. It struck me, holding those cards, that this was the real inheritance, not the accounts, not the properties, not even the trust itself, but the proof in my own handwriting and his that we had shown up for each other for decades without needing an audience to witness it. I began, slowly, to rebuild a rhythm that felt like mine again. I repainted the sunroom a soft, pale yellow, the color Patrick always said reminded him of the kitchen in his childhood home. I started walking the lake trail 3 mornings a week, the cold air sharpening something in me that had gone dull during the months of fighting. I said yes to dinner invitations I would have once declined out of exhaustion, and I found, to my quiet surprise, that laughter still came easily when I let it. If this story reminded you of a time when you had to reclaim your voice, your worth, or your place within your own family's legacy, I want you to know that you are not alone. Stories like this carry pieces of all of us, quietly woven into the lives we live long after the credits should have rolled. And sometimes, the quietest victories are the ones that matter most of all. Thank you for walking this journey with me.